So today I address the second of two footholds for the contemporary programmatic debate. First was the United States and the second is Europe, European social democracy. And everything that I talk about today, I'm going to come back to in greater detail later on when we address the substantive themes of the reconstruction of the economy, the reconstruction of politics, and the reconstruction of culture. Today, I just want to give a sense of the direction that would emerge from the European context in the light of the ideas that I've been proposing to you. European social democracy has been, in the first instance, a decommodification process. And that is the first theme of today's class. Decommodification meaning to take a series of claims and rights out of the context of the market insecurity, economic volatility, and to reinterpret them as entitlements. The greatest historical achievement of European social democracy has been to sustain a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. And for that accomplishment, European social democracy has become famous in the whole world. It is the most prestigious political project in the world. If the world could vote, it would vote, for example, to become Sweden, not to become the United States. But at the same time, and this leads me then to the second theme of today's class, European social democracy is deficient in what should be at least half of our programmatic concerns. It's not enough to organize a series of havens, safeguards, as for example Roosevelt did in the United States, unless also there's a storm of innovation, of creation, of novelty in the world. And so for that reason, my argument about social democracy will sometimes seem harsh, but it is addressed and is directed to this objective of suggesting a path beyond today's dictatorship of no alternatives. Now, remember my discussion 2 weeks ago of inequality and equality. And at that time, I enumerated 3 propositions about equality and structure. The first is that with respect to equality, structural change in the institutional order of the economy and of politics trumps everything else. The second proposition, in hierarchical order going down, is that with regard to the budget, on both the revenue-raising side and the spending side, what matters most in the short term is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent, rather than the egalitarian profile of the budget on its revenue-raising side, on its taxation side. And the third proposition is that if we really want to promote direct redistribution, the most efficient way to do so is through a system that gives a central role to an individualized consumption tax and to the direct taxation of the hereditary transmission of property at the time of death. Now, European social democracy is especially pertinent to the second of these 3 propositions, Therein lies the fundamental accomplishment of the Europeans, to have sustained this high level of investment in people and their capabilities, paradoxically financed by the regressive taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. It should not be interpreted as a campaign for equality of outcome or circumstance. Its egalitarian effects were oblique and indirect, and they arose from the success of the Europeans in ensuring the second of those three propositions, that is the high level of entitlements, financed by the regressive taxation of consumption. So the deficiency that I'm arguing to exist in European social democracy is the absence of any forward progress in creation, in innovation, in the storm of creativity which we require from the alternative. Now let's begin with an unsentimental view of social democracy. Social democracy is the beneficiary of a great deal of sentimental approval in the world, but we should see it coldly for what it is. So historically, it arose from a retreat, especially after the First World War, although prefigured by Bismarck's social policy in Germany and one nation Tory social policy in Britain. A retreat from the spheres of politics and of production. Social democracy was the outcome of a withdrawal of the left of the progressives and of the socially minded conservatives from the attempt to reorganize politics and to reorganize production. And in return for this withdrawal, they established then a strong presence in the sphere of distribution or redistribution. Its egalitarian effects were oblique or indirect. It was mainly, as I suggested a moment ago, a decommodification, a restraint on market instability in relation to the social rights of the majority of the people. Unsentimentally viewed, this social democratic project was composed of three sets of arrangements. First, the defense of the rights of incumbents or insiders against outsiders or challengers. First of all, incumbents in the labor market, the core of a relatively stable labor force against precariously employed workers. Second, small business, especially in agriculture, against big business. And third, those who control corporate entities against those who sought to control them, the challengers. The second set of arrangements that define the horizon of historical social democracy were so-called incomes policies or social contracts, which attempted to establish agreements between organized labor and big business, brokered by national governments, to distribute the benefits and burdens of alternative macroeconomic policies, on the assumption that a consensual arrangement, agreement about the distribution of the benefits and burdens would be much less costly to the nation. So it was a deliberate attempt initiated by the government in dialogue, in concert with the major organized interests in society, to diminish the level, the intensity of distributive conflict, especially distributive conflict between big business and organized labor. And the third set of arrangements then were an extensive set of social entitlements funded by the national government. Now, this arrangement has been so successful historically in Europe that no right-wing government in Europe in the last 2 generations has succeeded or even attempted in securing a significant diminishment of the entitlements. The right-wing parties in power have supported the system almost as much as the left-wing ones. And the electorates, independently of how they vote for the left or for the right, have become accustomed to relying on the security of the system of entitlements. Now, nevertheless, there are 3 great areas in which this enormous historical success has proved inadequate. First, in the consequences of the hierarchical segmentation of the production system. The chasm that deepens between the productive vanguards and the rest of the economy. Second, in the fragility of social cohesion. The main form of social cohesion under historical social democracy has been the distribution of entitlements by the state to care for people who are in need, against the background of a high level of ethnic, cultural, social, and religious homogeneity. The erosion of this level of homogeneity, provoked by migratory flows, has exposed the insufficiency, the inadequacy of money as a social cement. And this inadequacy has in turn been exploited by the right-wing parties and movements. Third, it has become clear that the rhythm of European history in the 20th century was a rhythm in which, to a very large extent, significant change, structural change, has depended on war. War, military conflict, sacrifice, blood has been the traumatic inducement to change. And the European societies have been unable to organize a a form of political life that would diminish the dependence of transformation on trauma. Now, what I want to do in this class is mainly to outline in the broadest terms, and I'm going to come back to each of the elements of these terms, the nature of these deficiencies or these failures, because they signal the direction of a programmatic proposal now. So before we come to the production system, the economy, let me say this, the tenor of the argument that I want to discuss with you is one that says distribution is not enough. There has to be a productivist project, a productivist vision. That's the narrow form, the economic form of the argument. The larger form of the argument is the havens, the safeguards are not enough unless there is established the cause of energy, of innovation, of novelty, of energy, of creative energy in the society. So the argument about the productivist project is simply the special case of the general argument about innovation, about the perpetual production of the new. Now let me take as a preliminary to the argument about production the debate about the provision of social services by the state, which is, after all, the special province of this decommodification project. The decommodification project manifests itself, especially in the attempt to say, we'll take health, education, the social services out of the sphere of buying and selling, and will establish them as rights. Now, what is today the project of the progressives with regard to social services? Here's a paradox. There does not seem to be any administrative counterpart to the idea of post-Fordist production of the knowledge economy. Mass production, conventional industry was, remember, the large-scale production of standardized goods and services through relatively rigid machines and production processes and very specialized and hierarchical relations of production. And conventional industry, as this is in decline and crisis all over the world, to be replaced by the knowledge economy, which is one of the main topics of our discussion in this semester. What is the counterpart to the knowledge economy in administration, in the administrative provision of public services? There seems to be none, other than the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. So here is what I have in mind as the kind of thing that might count as an alternative. When we say, the state should provide a universal minimum of public services. At the same time, the state should operate at the ceiling in the provision of the most complex and innovative and costly public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state should cooperate with independent civil society, acting through the instrumentality of cooperatives or groups in the experimentalist provision of public services for two reasons. First of all, as the most effective way to improve their quality, and second, as the most powerful inducement to the organization of civil society outside the state. By participating cooperatively, not for profit, through professional cooperatives of one type or another in the provision of public services, civil society would share directly in the creation of its own future. And that would be the alternative to the mere privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. Now, there's no developed administrative counterpart to post-Fordist experimentalist production. Remember that in Europe, post-Fordist production has thrived, often in the regions that were characterized by pre-Fordist production, by customized production as opposed to mass production. In Emilia-Romagna, in Baden-Württemberg, in Catalonia. Because these regions were characterized by dense networks of technical education, apprenticeship, and good local government. So the state would develop its arsenal of methods by collaborating with independent civil society, cooperatively organized in the provision of public services. Now we come to the question. Now let me stop there for a moment and ask whether someone wants to make a remark about this. It's a very interesting sphere of innovation, the provision of public services. Because it is a topic which is already at the center of electoral politics all over the world, the quality of public services is a characteristic focus of electoral struggle, and it's already the focus. So the issue already arises, how can we improve the quality? By what means is the state to act? And why should the state act in the spirit of the command and control Fordist industries of the past century? Yes.
I feel like every time I ask a question, you're about to answer it anyway, but I'll do it. How do you define your ceiling and how do you define your floor? What do you see as sitting within those categories?
Well, of course, that's heavily dependent on the level of development and wealth of the society of the country. So what's a floor for one country is not a floor for another country. But the basic idea is that the floor should be the highest possible, given the level of development. If the objective is not egalitarian redistribution, but empowerment, qualification, and that is the objective of the public services. The objective is agency. The enhancement of agency is the controlling ideal. So the state should do as much as it can for the enhancement of agency, but its work should then be supplemented or detailed by these arrangements with civil society cooperatively organized. That's the basic idea.
Sorry. And the ceiling?
Excuse me?
And the ceiling? That's the floor, right?
Well, the ceiling is the same idea, right? The ceiling is what cannot be done by civil society adequately because it's too complicated. Like the defense industry in relation to other industries has to be done by the state as the funder of last resort of the public services. To take the jumps into another world, as it has with respect to technology in the defense industry. We don't think of public services in that light, but we should, because public services present a direct analog to the defense equipment of the state. Now I'm saying this approach to public services is the preliminary then to the project for the economy, for the production system. And again, I insist, the progressives on the whole have no productivist project. They have no project for the reorganization, the redirection of the production system. Now, I want to suggest that their productivist project could be described by two slogans. One slogan is popular capitalism, and the second slogan is a knowledge economy for the many rather than a knowledge economy for the few as we now have. Now, first of all, popular capitalism. You know, I'm a skeptic about the category of capitalism. I don't believe in this Marxist category of capitalism because it presupposes that there's this menu of indivisible institutional systems in history waiting to be realized. I don't think that exists. What exists are particular forms of the market economy, but they're not elements of a system from which societies choose. But I think that in reality, this slogan, popular capitalism, has immediate attraction in the conditions of the contemporary world. And here's a paradox. Here's a strange thing about the contemporary situation. You would think that the first thing that the right-wing parties in Europe and other parts of the world would propose would be a popular capitalism. They would say, we believe in capitalism. We don't think capitalism is an affair of the elites. Capitalism is an affair of the masses. And the reason for that comes from the claim I made at the beginning of the course, that the main constituency in the world today is a constituency composed of people who are still poor and remain disorganized, but whose horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian in the Marxist sense, is petty bourgeois. The default object of their aspirations is to have a small business, a small family business. And you know, family businesses are typically based on family saving and self-exploitation meaning that those who work in them work often excessive hours, extraordinary hours, and make tremendous sacrifices for the sake of the family firm. So a large part of humanity wants to join the small business class. The objective petty bourgeoisie is a small minority in every country in the world. But the subjective petty bourgeoisie, meaning the would-be petty entrepreneurs or petty proprietors, are, one might think, the majority of humanity. That's what most men and women want. And nothing would be more natural for a right-wing party or a right-wing movement than to say, we propose the popular version of this idea. It's not for the bankers, it's not for the financiers, it's not for the corporate executives, it's for this majority of humanity. So it is astonishing that that doesn't happen. Instead, the right-wing movements in power typically attempt to please the lobby of high finance and to dislocate, to transfer the scene of conflict to identity politics. The identity politics of the majority against the identity politics of the minority. As if the aim were to circumvent the debate or the problem rather than to address it directly. That's the first slogan. And the second slogan is the slogan of a knowledge economy for the many. Instead of having a knowledge economy that is for a fraction of the labor force, a knowledge economy for the majority of the labor force. Now, there are two series of transformations that have a commanding influence on these projects, on the feasibility of popular capitalism, and on the ability to build a knowledge economy for the many out of the materials of what we have, the knowledge economy for the few. The two long-term influences on these momentous transformations are the logic of technological evolution and the logic of private property. And now let me say just a word about each of these, because they will be some of our main topics in the following weeks. I return to a suggestion I made earlier. We have two ways of thinking about technology. One way is to think of technology as the materialization of a channel between our experiments in the mobilization of natural forces in our favor, like the electrical force, the nuclear force, the magnetic force, and our experiments in the technical division of labor, in how we work together. That's what technology is. It's simply the material form of that connection. A second way of thinking about technology is technology marks the movable frontier between what we have already learned how to repeat and what we have not yet learned how to repeat. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we can embody the formula or the algorithm in the mechanical device. On this view, the point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat. so that we can use our time to work with the machine and create or achieve the not yet repeatable. Now contrast these two logics of technological evolution. The one is the logic that exists and is established, the hegemonic logic. It first develops technologies in the form that is easiest for the largest firms with the greatest pools of liquid capital to internalize. The alternative logic would be the logic that develops the technologies in a decentralized form, as for example, AI on the edge, as it's sometimes called, or instead of the rigid chips, with fixed configurations, the FPGA technology that allows for the circuits to be refashioned by the user in the course of the use. So this flexible technology is not less sophisticated, it's more sophisticated. But its greatest beneficiaries, rather than being the largest firms with the greatest pools of liquid capital, are the mass of small businesses and of individual economic agents, like the machine repairman or the nurse practitioner. That would be the first stage of the contrast between the two logics of technological evolution that I'm imagining. The second stage is one in which the hegemonic logic, the dominant logic, is one that puts front and center the idea of automation. The objective is the replacement of the worker, commanding the evolution of the technology of the knowledge economy. The alternative logic is the logic that treats the objective not as the replacement of the worker by the machine, but the equipment and empowerment of the worker. And the basic idea is very simply that the combination of worker and machine is in principle immensely more powerful than the worker or the machine alone. The third stage of this contrast between the two logics of evolution has to do with the long-term objective. On the hegemonic logic, on the established logic, the long-term objective is what is now described as general artificial intelligence. The long-term objective is a machine that, as much as possible, simulates or replaces the human mind. That does everything that the mind can do. The alternative idea of the long-term goal starts from a completely different place. And it takes as the objective not the creation of a machine that resembles the human mind as much as possible, but a machine that is completely different from the human mind, that has powers that the human mind cannot have, computational powers. But then for precisely that reason, in this division of labor can interact with the human mind. And what does the human being have that the machine lacks in principle? Vision, imagination, the ability to prefigure something else in the space of the adjacent possible, to see more and not just to be clever, not just to be able to make more recombinations or operations, but to see something from a fundamentally different perspective and to make a leap of insight into that other world. Now, of course, the capacity to act on this alternative logic of technological evolution, which I've now contrasted at these three different stages, depends on power and property. And that then leads to the general idea about the uplift of the subjective petty bourgeoisie. The people who are in these small family businesses, archaic, retrograde, with low productivity, how could they be lifted up? Now let me imagine a long sequence of events going all the way from the modest beginnings to the revolutionary future. The modest beginning takes people from where they are, finds them where they are. And you can imagine it in one institutional vocabulary as a 21st century counterpart to 19th century agricultural extension. Remember my evocation of what the Americans did in organizing family-scale agriculture in the first half of the 19th century. Through what we, in today's vocabulary, would describe as strategic coordination or partnership between the government, the local government, and to some extent the national government on one side, and the family farmer on the other side. Organizing the system of agricultural insurance. Organizing the counter-cyclical management of agricultural prices. Organizing the provision to the farmer of the cognitive basis of scientific agriculture through the land-grant colleges. And in all these ways, creating the basis for an agriculture that was a family scale, but not a subsistence agriculture, a scientific revolutionary agriculture, which turned out to be the most efficient system of family agriculture that's ever existed in the world up to that point. And among the family farmers, what we today would describe as cooperative competition. They were independent proprietors. They competed against one another, but at the same time they pooled resources, including labor, by working on one another's farms. Now this uplift operation would not take either of the two forms of government-business relations that are now established in the world. There's the American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government, and there's the Northeast Asian model coming out of Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and now China, of the formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. This would require a third model of government-business relations. That would be decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimentalist, in which the crucial agents would be support or service centers intermediate between the government and the producer, who would conduct these industrial policies in a pluralistic and experimental way. And now there would be two main adversaries or targets of this uplift effort. One target would be the backward small and medium-sized firms of the peripheral economy, of the production system. The mainstay of the small business class. The object of fascination, of seduction by the subjective petty bourgeoisie. And the other target, the other adversary, would be the multitude of individual economic agents who have no stable relations to any business organization and who today form a major part of the labor force in every economy in the world. So the aim is to accompany them in this transition to higher and higher abilities for assimilation of technology and superior practice. This movable frontier. Let's say that's one side of the polarity. Beginning modestly from where we are in the contemporary economies. At the opposite side of the polarity, far into a speculative future, we can imagine that the main capital resources of society are vested in independent funds, professionally and competitively managed. And that these funds are then auctioned off to those who would use them, who then are credentialed. They credential themselves the way anyone in a private auction credentials himself to auction, to place bids. And the funds then temporarily auction off the use of the capital resources of society. No one has major property permanently. People acquire property conditionally and temporarily. And retain property so long as they can provide the funds with the highest rate of return. Now you can imagine, of course, that these funds would be established by law under different legal regimes that compare different systems for assessing rate and return. And that the democratic institutions would then increase or diminish how much resources they control in the light of the comparative experience. Now, this idea of the capital auction may seem to you absurd and a dream, but you should immediately notice that actually this capital auction is supposedly what already happens according to the orthodox theory of finance. According to the orthodox theory, a perfectly competitive financial market without asymmetries of information already auctions off capital to its most efficient users. it fails to auction it off to its most efficient users, it must be because of some defect in competition or in symmetry of information. So all this thought experiment does is take this theory and seriously. It says, let's imagine that this is in fact what happens. Now, of course, there are immensely problems of design and risk that one would confront in organizing such a system to operate. And let's be clear that this way of decentralizing the allocation of capital could never be the only way. After all, the absolute property right theorized in the 19th century has an enormous advantage. Its advantage is to allow someone, the owner, to do something at his own initiative and at his own risk that no one else believes in. That's the advantage of the classic, unified, absolute, unconditional property right. But why should it be the only form for the decentralized allocation of capital? In a free economy, in a free market order, there should be many property regimes coexisting experimentally. And we should be able to observe empirically what works best and which regime produces which effects. So the absolute property right might be best for wild, risky investments and speculation. But all the forms of enterprise that require the combination or superimposition of different stakeholders with claims on the same resources might be best served by an arrangement such as the one that I described. Now, the basic intuition that I'm arguing for is that the design of the knowledge economy over time would be largely the product of the combination of these two axes of change. The logic of technological evolution and the logic of the property rights. The reinvention of technology and the reinvention of property. The premise of the reinvention of technology is that there is no immanent logic of technological evolution. It's not obvious how or in what direction technology should develop. In a real social situation, in a real economic order, of course, there will always be a path of least resistance, which will be the evolutionary form that best suits the dominant interests and the dominant ideas in that historical circumstance. But it is to the advantage, to the benefit of the society, to relax the restraint that these dominant interests impose. And we observe, looking back at history, that the path of least resistance is always the most probable path, but it is never the only path or the necessary path. Repeatedly in the course of technological evolution, the enemies of the path of least resistance are able to exploit the affinity between their cause and the cause of the economic empowerment of some excluded part of the labor force. me give you an example from military history. At the end of the 18th century, during the period of the Napoleonic Wars, new artillery pieces were invented, and the ballistic potential of this artillery could only be fully exploited, taken advantage of, by armies that were capable of maneuvering in the field, to combine flexibly with the artillery. Now, the armies of the autocratic European states that Napoleon combated in the name of revolutionary France were armies of conscripted peasants. And they would run away on the battlefield unless there were soldiers with bayonets standing behind them and preventing them from running away. So those autocracies were unable to take advantage of the technological potential of the new artillery because it required trust and flexibility in the field, which they did not have, did not enjoy. So Napoleon had a decisive advantage on the battlefield in his ability to use the potential of the new artillery. Now, I'm giving that example because it's not an atypical example, it's a typical example of what happens in the course of the evolution of technology. The technology develops in a way that suits the dominant interest, what I call the path of least resistance. But the path of least resistance is characteristically always sacrificing some technological potential of the new technology. The fuller use of that potential would be radical. It would require the inclusion, the mobilization of a larger popular interest. That's what's typical about the example. The details are specific, of course, but the architecture of the example is universal. So now I'm not designing a project, I'm describing in the broadest outline a direction. And I'm saying, here it is. The direction arises from the reinvention of the logic of technology combined with the reinvention of the logic of property. The premise of the idea of reinventing the logic of technology is that technological evolution has no immanent logic. It has a logic that we give it. Ordinarily, we give it the logic that suits the path of least resistance. The premise of the logic of property is that the market order has no intrinsic legal logic. That's the idea that was debated in the 19th century, as I mentioned early in the course. The central theme of American legal thought from the start of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century was that there is no natural and necessary way of organizing a market order. That we cannot infer from the abstractions of private property and freedom of contract a series of propositions in a descending order of concreteness and infer the answers by analysis back to the abstract ideas of property and contract. What the American jurists demonstrated in those 150 years is that at each step down the ladder of concreteness, there were choices that could be made, and that the choices could not be resolved by inference from the abstractions of property or contract. They could only be resolved by conflicts of vision and of interest. So a productivist project, is what I'm claiming the progressives lack, is a project that they could acquire in the process of responding in detail, according to their circumstance, to the choices and opportunities of the moment with respect to the logic of technological evolution and the logic of the system of property. Their aim with respect to property is not to put one form of economic decentralization in place of another, like the capital auction in place of the property rights. Their aim would be to say, the market order should not be nailed to the cross of a single dogmatic version of itself. The traditional absolute property right should be one of the forms because it has the advantage that I cited, but it should not be the only form. There should be these other forms, and some of them should presuppose the radical disaggregation of the unified property right. That's the argument. And that argument would take on detail and drama, pressure, in the light of the objective, first, of organizing a popular capitalism in a world in which most people want to be little capitalists, and second, of organizing a knowledge economy for the many in a world in which most people are victims of the knowledge economy for a few. So everything in these examples or these ideas depends on this mixture of tangible detail, texture, with the impulse, the direction. Now let me add some more elements then to this picture of the productivist project that would come after social democracy. So after the progressives abandoned Marxism, they embraced Keynesianism, the Keynesian counter-cyclical management of the economy. And they see the defenders of fiscal austerity as among their major enemies. But a study of the contemporary world suggests that, in fact, fiscal austerity may be important or even vital to the progressives. Not as a way of satisfying the interests and prejudices of high finance, but as a way of preventing the country from being on its knees before high finance. This is something that the Chinese understood. It's necessary to have expensive hard currency reserves and forced saving, forced private and public saving, so that the country could defy the financial markets so that the level of economic activity would not depend on the level of financial confidence, which is what Kalecki said the gold standard made the level of activity depend on at the end of the 19th century. Not to placate finance, but to defy it. And the argument for rebellion, for having the potential to rebel, to defy, to say no, seems to be much more important than all the advantages of counter-cyclical management of the economy. So this obviously would be a very long debate, but I'm simply introducing a complicating factor to say that things are not what they seem with respect to financial activity. Now, another question is another example of the economic alternative to conventional social democracy regards the relation of labor to capital. Unionization is a mechanism that is declining in every economy of the world. In the United States, for example, unions mainly survive in government employment and in the third sector in philanthropy. They've almost disappeared entirely from the private economy. And in every economy in the world, including the European economy, a larger and larger part of the labor force is in precarious employment. So there are two main discourses about labor now in the world. There's the syndicalist discourse, embraced by organized labor and the union leaders, that defends the interests of the organized minority against the interests of the disorganized majority of workers. And there's the neoliberal discourse, which accepts the idea of radical insecurity of labor, freedom to dismiss the workers, under the mantra of economic flexibility. It is impossible to have a permanent revolution of productivity if there is a persistent downward tilt to the returns to labor. So the maintenance of an upward tilt to the returns to labor is an important counterpart to this effort to develop a productivist project. So we cannot accept in any large economy the predominance of precarious labor, because just as a slave economy is incompatible with radical innovation, so too radical innovation is incompatible with an economy in which the vast majority of workers are condemned to precarious employment. Now, what's the solution? So imagine a distinction between the organized and the unorganized part of the labor force. It may be too late to do anything about the failure of unionization. But there was a solution even though now it may have come too late. So notice that there isn't just one, there are two systems of labor law in the world. There's the North Atlantic system of collective bargaining, which is what we're all familiar with here, in which the collective bargain based on the power of the union is the antidote to economic duress and reestablishes the reality of contract in the circumstances of radically unequal bargaining power. But there was, or there still is, in the 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century, an alternative to collective bargaining. It's the corporatist labor law regime which prevailed in all of Latin America, and which was inspired by Mussolini's Carta del Lavoro, by the fascist system of collective bargaining. Collective bargaining depends on two principles. The first principle is the workers choose or not to unionize. Unionization is purely voluntary. The second principle is the unions are completely independent from the state. The alternative regime, the corporatist labor law regime, which was introduced into Latin America by the populist nationalist regimes, rather than by admirers of Mussolini's labor laws, was based on two opposite principles. The first was, all workers are automatically unionized. Everyone is automatically unionized. Normally the unions would be controlled by the government through a Ministry of Labor. So there would be a form of more or less overt tutelage of the unions by the government. But it doesn't have to be that way. You could say, everyone will be automatically unionized according to their position in the production system. But the unions will be completely independent from the state. And different labor movements will compete for position in this unitary union structure, just as different political parties compete for position in the unitary structure of the state. That would be a hybrid regime. This hybrid regime would be, in my opinion, vastly superior to both of the regimes that now exist. And there's no reason why it can't be established. There's no reason why it couldn't be established before, and there's no reason why it can't be established now. It's not established, I think, not just because it would arouse opposition, but out of pure ignorance. People don't understand that such an alternative exists. But it does exist. Now, maybe, although it does exist, it's too late. And this is a very important point to understand about institutional innovation. The repertoire of institutional alternatives available in the world at any given point is relatively inelastic. You can call the spirits, but they may not come. So as I said before when we were discussing Roosevelt, Roosevelt was a radical experimentalist, but he was a victim of the ideas that were available at his time, in his milieu. So maybe it's too late for this alternative, but this would be the obvious alternative. So in the absence of this alternative, if you want inclusion and sustained rise in productivity, you can't allow the majority of the labor force to be precarious and insecure. No radical innovation in a slave economy. You have to have an upward tilt to the returns to labor. That means that we have to have a legal regime which defends the rights of otherwise precarious labor. For example, by establishing a principle of price neutrality, which requires that labor rendered under conditions of precarious employment be remunerated at least a level comparable to the level of similar labor rendered under conditions of stable employment. There are any number of legal devices by which we might craft a solution to this problem if we recognize it as a problem, which we don't. So the discussion about the capital auction and about the evolutionary logic of technology, then we also require a series of connected or parallel debates about all these issues, like the relation between labor and capital. And of course, the attempt to create a popular capitalism. And a knowledge economy for the many, the two great parallel projects which I've just evoked. We also require a radical change in the form of education of the masses, the majority of people. A form of education that was focused on the uplift of the analytic and synthetic capabilities of most people, that define the central topic of education as insight into transformation. That's how we understand anything. We understand anything by understanding how it's transformed. So the most important form of education is education about transformative power. How do natural phenomena or social phenomena change? We understand any phenomenon, natural or social, only to the extent that we understand how it changes. That's the fundamental topic of education. We acquire this understanding only in dealing with content. We don't acquire it in the abstract. But with respect to content, what matters is selective depth, not encyclopedic superficiality. So education should be project-oriented or thematic. And everything should be taught at least twice. Once we admit that education should be selective rather than encyclopedic, there's plenty of time. And there's plenty of time then to deal with education in this spirit. Everything taught twice. Every capacity taught twice. From opposing points of view, dialectically, the only way to empower the mind. So all of that, I'm putting under the umbrella of empowerment for the sake of productivism, a productivist impulse, not the distributivist impulse, which is the sole concern of orthodox social democracy, but the productivist impulse, which now requires to lead. Now, there are at least two central concerns that remain beyond the frontiers of this argument. This is all about the productivist impulse and the enhancement of agency, the individual human being turning the tables on his circumstance. Learning how to define, to interrogate, to resist. The second large theme is the theme of cohesion. What is the basis of cohesion under and beyond social democracy? It seems that under historically conventional social democracy, the basis of cohesion is money transfers organized by the state. Against the background of a high level of social, ethnic, cultural, religious homogeneity. So take a typical social democratic country like Sweden. Sweden was a country of peasants which became rich. And has been unable to deal with the disaggregation, with the division that arises from the erosion of homogeneity, the characteristic sickness of the social democracies. Homogeneity is eroded by migratory flows, and the erosion of homogeneity exposes the inadequacy of money as a social cement. The only adequate basis of homogeneity is doing things together, is shared purposive action. Or mandatory purpose of action. So, for example, saying that everyone has to share in the work of defending the country. You can't get out of it by paying someone. And everyone has to have two responsibilities in the production system. A responsibility in the production system, but also a responsibility to act beyond the bounds of family selfishness, helping to take care of people outside one's own family. The only adequate social cement is direct responsibility for other people. Everything else is inadequate. And social democracy wants to get out of it by payments. But there's no payment. Saving other people or helping them. So, for example, there would have to be a system of mandatory care. Everyone, in principle, principle, everyone is responsible to defend their country. And when they're not needed to defend, they're needed to care. But no one can, just by money, excuse themselves from the obligation to care and to defend. And that's the only adequate basis of concern and commitment. So that's the second major theme. Beyond productivism, cohesion, solidarity, care. And the third theme has to do with politics. So the basic rhythm of European life in the 20th century was that the Europeans awake when they're slaughtering one another, and then they fall asleep when peace is reestablished, and drown their sorrows in consumption. A form of politics is necessary to wake them up. Now, the nature of this imperative becomes most evident in the organization of the European Union, not in the organization of the particular states. So the European Union is now being organized on the principle that the endowments of the citizens will be defined and defended by the local authorities. Their educational endowments, their social endowments. And the principles governing their economic organization will be defined by European law. But this is the exact opposite of what one would desire. One would desire that the endowments, the social and cultural endowments of the citizens of the Union be universal in the Union. But that they all have the greatest possible latitude to diverge in their way of carrying out the mandates of the Union. So it's upside down from what was done. The Union of Jacques Delors is the union of marching in lockstep to the same commands, while allowing the member states to sort out how the endowments of the citizens states will be protected. You would want the opposite. You would say the Union should guarantee the capabilities, the endowments of all of its citizens, but they will have the greatest experimental latitude in their way of developing their cultural and their productivist projects. So this is all by way of arguing point with which I began. The decommodification, the safeguards, are not enough. Their meaning and their value depends on the other part of the story. The other part of the story is the storm of innovation, of novelty, of creation. The progressives should not be the humanizers of the inevitable. The progressive should be the storm. And the storm doesn't occur spontaneously. The storm has to be organized. The organization of the storm is the progressive project in its most important part. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. The theme of alternative. Now we have a few minutes. I've spoken too much and you've been too silent. So what's wrong with this project? About what? It's not a rhetorical question. Someone help me out? Yes.
Is this a peaceful project? Because I feel the storm analogy, and when I think about what you said about the incumbents and the path of least resistance, I don't see a smooth way of organizing this storm, in a political sense.
Organizing what?
This progressive project.
Because why? Because you see, what's the main problem?
So I don't see how this can come about in the current political setup. Like
In the current one?
in the current like mainstream democracies, for example. Like would people vote this project into power? Is that how you see this
Well,
unfold?
in these democracies, people vote for everything. They vote for the opposite. They vote for one thing and they vote for the opposite of the thing. So they seem to be dissatisfied with all the options before them. It's not as if they had a stable commitment to a single line. What do they want? So I think what's really hard in the political struggle is to have a sense of the limited possibilities at any given moment, but at the same time, the large sweep of the potential of the possibilities over time. And everything is dominated, right, by the drumbeat of mobilization, of war. are speculative possibilities? The states are warlike. They're at each other's throats. Permanent possibility of war. War among the armed states. That's the reality. And somehow, we have to take out of this situation a permanent war. The possibility of choosing directions under the specter of war. What impresses me enormously in this is I keep coming back to this theme of the options being so narrow. Where do they come from? It's just that this is what people know about, what they think about. The actual sequence of conflicts and options in the world is a tiny subset of the possibilities. Why? Humanity chooses among its leaders. They're unbelievable. Why these people? It's just totally arbitrary. Are these the Americans with the largest vision or scope? It's like accidents, one accident on top of another. So, in this whole argument that I've been struggling to maintain here, against the overwhelming impression of arbitrariness, there's no reason why these people are the people who decide things. Financiers, stockbrokers, bankers, dime a dozen, half serious. It's like a nightmare. So I think that this theory is a rebellion against fate. And it's amazing that when it's able to conduct it at all. It's an extraordinary spectacle. What attitude do you recommend? What should my attitude be? It's very strange because it's this mixture, right? It's not like Marcel Proust. It's not like just a series of human encounters without historical significance. It's more like Tolstoy. It's this mixture of the personal and the historical. We're swept into the wave of these historical events, which we don't control. We have barely any influence on it. But nevertheless, we insist on giving it a shape, on shaping it, on putting the imprint of our desires on it. I'm not sure what the alternative is. I believe in this. I think that it's better to resist fate than to deliver ourselves to fate. And I think that the most powerful idea in the world now that's alive in the world is this idea of agency, of action, turning the tables on fate, saying no, opposing. I still believe in it. Well, I'm barely coherent now. It's too difficult. It's difficult. So let's continue. Thank you for your patience. We'll see each other next week.
for the undergrads, should we take 5-minute break and then get started? Sounds good.